The summer air in Palm Springs was thick with heat and perfume. Juniper Ellis wiped her hands on her apron for the third time in 10 minutes, even though they weren't wet. She stood at the edge of the rooftop lounge at the Halston Resort, balancing a silver tray of cocktails, eyes darting between guests who smelled like money and indifference. The party was private, exclusive in the way that made everyone feel both important and watched. She wasn't supposed to notice details beyond the orders, but Juniper noticed everything, especially the man in the corner, the one who didn't belong. He wore a simple black button-down, sleeves rolled just high enough to reveal strong forearms, and a watch that looked unbranded, which meant it was probably worth more than her car. Unlike the others, he wasn't mingling. He wasn't even holding a drink. He stood with his hands in his pockets, facing the edge of the terrace, looking down at the desert below like he wanted to escape into it. His presence made her nervous, not because he looked dangerous, but because he looked familiar in a way she couldn't place, like a forgotten dream trying to surface. Her shift was almost over when he finally approached the bar. She was wiping down the counter, pretending not to notice him walking toward her. He didn't sit. He didn't smile. He simply leaned in slightly, voice quiet. Something cold. Not sweet. She nodded, poured him a soda with lime, and slid it across without speaking. He took one sip and looked at her as though she'd passed some kind of test. There was silence between them, the kind that didn't feel awkward, just real. "You're not from here," he said. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Is anyone?" He chuckled, and she caught a glimpse of something unexpected. Kindness behind the guarded exterior. His eyes, sharp and unreadable from afar, softened as he spoke again. "You don't pretend like the others." "I don't have time to pretend," she replied. She didn't ask his name. She had a rule about guests, especially ones who looked like they wore secrets better than suits. But when he left an hour later, he handed her a folded napkin with a note scribbled in black ink. "Same time tomorrow, if you want." She stared at the napkin long after he disappeared into the elevator. She should have thrown it away. She didn't. The next night he returned. Not for the party, he ignored everyone else, but for her. She was off duty by then, sitting at a staff table in the back, eating fries with chipped nails and tired eyes. He found her anyway, sat across from her without invitation, and handed her a cup of coffee, like they'd done this 100 times before. They talked for hours. He didn't flirt. He didn't perform. He asked questions that most people were too distracted to think of. What she used to love as a child, whether she remembered the first book that made her cry, why she always wore a bracelet that looked like it had been repaired a dozen times. She didn't know what she told him, not fully, only that it felt easy, safe, like speaking to someone who didn't need anything from her except the truth. That weekend they met again, and again. No expectations, no labels, just moments. He never told her his full name. She never asked. There was something sacred in the unknowing, something intoxicating about having a connection untouched by biography or status. On the final night of his stay, he kissed her, not quickly, not carelessly, but with the weight of someone who hadn't kissed in years, not because he couldn't, but because he hadn't wanted to. It made her dizzy. It made her want more. He whispered against her cheek, "I leave tomorrow." She nodded, pretending she'd expected that all along. "Will I see you again?" she asked before she could stop herself. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, really looked, and then walked into the night without a goodbye. Juniper stood alone in the moonlight, fingers still tingling, heart beating out questions she didn't have the courage to voice. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his world, but she would never forget the way he made her feel like she mattered, even just for one weekend. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after he left. Juniper came home from a long double shift at the diner, her feet aching, her hair pulled back in a tired knot, only to find a white envelope wedged beneath her front door. There was no return address, just her name, Juniper Ellis, written in handwriting she recognized immediately. The way the letters leaned slightly forward, the sharp curve on the J. She held the envelope like it might burn her, like opening it would make what happened between them too real, or worse, undo it. Inside there was a ticket, one way, to Seattle, and a note, folded once, pressed flat with precision. "Come if you want to know who I really am. Room 1803, Vesper Hotel. S." She stared at it for a long time. She should have thrown it away. She should have laughed and moved on. But Juniper wasn't the kind of woman who clung to fantasy. She had never been the girl who imagined men falling in love with her after one weekend. And yet something about that brief time with him had lingered. The calm in his voice, the way he never filled silence just to fill it, the way he looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, like she was someone worth knowing. She didn't pack much. One bag, two dresses, a sketchbook she hadn't touched in over a year. When the plane landed, it was raining. The kind of fine, misty rain that clings to the air instead of falling. The Vesper Hotel towered above the downtown skyline, all glass and steel, glowing like it didn't belong to the same city as the sidewalks beneath it. Room 1803 was at the end of a silent hallway. She stood outside the door for nearly a minute before knocking. The door opened almost immediately, and there he was. The same man, and not the same. He was dressed in a black suit this time, tailored to perfection, his hair more controlled, his posture stiffer. But his eyes, they were exactly as she remembered. For a moment, they just stood there, neither speaking. Then he stepped aside and let her in. The room was spacious but impersonal, like he'd only just arrived and never planned to stay. She walked to the window, looked down at the city below, her arms crossed against the cold. "So," she said, not turning around, "who are you, really?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to a table, opened a drawer, and pulled out a marriage license. Her name was already printed. She turned slowly, blinking. "What is this?" He handed her a second envelope. Inside was a prenuptial agreement. It was clean, clinical, and one-sided. She skimmed it quickly, her heart pounding. It offered protection, sure. It even allowed her freedom. But it read more like a business contract than a vow. "I want to marry you," he said finally, "but not in the way people think." She stared at him, stunned. "You don't even know me." "I do," he said. "Not the facts, not your history, but I know how you make me feel. And I know I haven't felt anything this real in years." She dropped the papers onto the table. "Is this a joke? Some rich man's experiment?" "No," he said quickly, too quickly, then softer. "This isn't a fairy tale. I'm not a good man. I'm not even sure I know how to be a husband. But I want something real. With you. Without the noise, no press, no ceremony, just us." Juniper took a shaky breath. The part of her that wanted stability, safety, screamed to walk away. But there was another part. The part that still remembered how he sat with her for hours in silence, how he never looked at his phone, how he kissed her like she was the first moment of peace he'd found in years. That part didn't want to run. She lifted her chin. "And what happens after?" He looked her dead in the eyes. "We disappear, just for a while. No headlines, no obligations. We figure it out together." That night in a courthouse 2 hours outside the city, Juniper Ellis became Juniper Creed. No ring, no family, no flowers, just a signature. Just a man who said he didn't believe in love, but needed her more than he knew how to say. She didn't know what would come of it, but she knew she had just taken a step over a line she could never uncross. The silence came gradually, not all at once. In the beginning, it felt like calm. Juniper and Silas retreated to a quiet rental home tucked in the hills of Whidbey Island, a place with no cell service and no need for pretense. Days passed in soft rhythms, making breakfast together in silence, reading by the fireplace, walking the fog-lined trails where no one knew their names. It was strange, almost dreamlike, how easy it was to pretend the world didn't exist outside that small house. For the first time in her adult life, Juniper wasn't surviving. She was simply being. Silas was attentive in his way, not overly affectionate, but always present. He cooked with her, asked her about her art, sometimes stayed up just to listen to her hum while sketching. He never raised his voice. He never pulled away physically. But the emotional weight between them was always there, like a closed door she never had the key for. She asked about his past once. What had made him so careful, so distant? He answered with a shrug and a cryptic, "Some things are safer buried." She let it go, not because she didn't care, but because he said it with such finality, like a man terrified of opening something even he couldn't close again. They didn't talk about their future. There were no plans for a house, no discussions of children or holidays. It was always now, never next. At first, that suited Juniper. She liked the simplicity, the illusion of being in control. But illusions fade. By the fourth month of marriage, the distance between them began to feel colder. Silas had to return to business, as he vaguely called it. She never asked for details, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders each time he stepped outside to take a call. He never said where he was going, only that it would be just a few weeks. Then it became a month, then 6 weeks. And the calls became fewer. His tone grew clipped, like a stranger checking in out of obligation. She told herself he was busy. Important men were always busy. But when his lawyer contacted her instead of him, requesting she sign something for her own legal clarity, a prickle of alarm sank into her spine. The document was formal and cold. An amendment to the prenup stating she had no financial claim, no rights, and no access to certain protected assets. There was a line near the bottom. This document ensures both parties maintain independence and privacy as originally agreed. There was no mention of love, no mention of her by name. Juniper didn't sign. She called Silas. He didn't answer. She left 3 voicemails. No reply. She emailed a simple message. Did I imagine all of it? Nothing. It wasn't anger she felt. It wasn't even heartbreak. It was a quiet suffocation, a sense that she had been neatly folded out of the story like a page torn from a book no one wanted to read again. One morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, staring at her own reflection, when she realized she hadn't said his name out loud in over a week. The silence wasn't just between calls. It had crept inside her, dulling the brightness she didn't even know she had begun to grow. She looked down at the small drawer where she kept a stick of lipstick she never wore, and paused. She hadn't had a reason to dress up in months. She hadn't had someone look at her like she mattered in even longer. 2 weeks later, a certified envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a letter with a corporate header, signed by someone she had never met. It confirmed her legal marital status as resolved by private dissolution. No court appearance, no conversation, just a signature. Her name was erased from everything. There was no letter from him, no explanation, just quiet, cold efficiency, as if she had never existed. That night, Juniper sat in the kitchen, surrounded by stillness in the soft hum of a refrigerator. Her hands rested on her stomach in a gesture that had become unconscious over the last several days. The nausea, the lightheadedness, the strange pull in her lower abdomen. It all made sense now. She had taken the test hours earlier, convinced it was stress. It wasn't stress. She was pregnant, with twins. She stared at the second pink line on the test strip and felt the kind of stillness that wasn't peace. It was realization. There would be no letters, no calls, no husband walking through the door to say he'd made a mistake. She was on her own now, and somewhere in the pit of that silence, something hardened. Not in bitterness, in clarity. He had taken her name from a document, but he would never take her children from her story. Juniper moved to Vermont in the middle of winter. The roads were half buried in snow, the skies always a shade of gray that made everything feel suspended and quiet, and she welcomed it. She found a small rental house on the edge of a quiet town called Marlow. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and creaky wooden floors that moaned at night like the house was trying to remember who it once belonged to. She didn't have much money, but she had enough to get started. She took a job at a used bookstore and worked part-time at a local bakery on weekends. People in town were polite but distant, which suited her perfectly. No one asked about the father. No one asked why a woman who seemed so young moved there alone and pregnant. She carried her story like armor and wrapped it tightly around her every time someone looked a little too long. Her pregnancy wasn't easy, but she made it through. The twins were born in late spring, just as the snow melted and wildflowers began to claw their way through the thawing earth. A boy and a girl, Indigo and Nash. She gave them both her last name and refused to leave the father section of the birth certificate blank. Instead, she wrote a single dash. No name, no claim, just space. Raising them alone was a storm she didn't always feel strong enough to weather, but she did it, day by day, bottle by bottle, night by sleepless night. She learned how to be 2 parents in 1 body, how to calm 2 cries with 1 heartbeat, how to take joy in moments so small the world wouldn't even notice them. There were times she broke down. After both babies got fevers at the same time, After working a double shift with cracked heels and barely any sleep, after getting rejection letters from night classes she'd hoped would help her build a better future. But there were also times she laughed out loud, just her and the babies in the living room, surrounded by stuffed animals and spilled formula, laughing until she cried because Indigo had managed to put a sock on Nash's head while he was sleeping. Her love for them scared her sometimes. It was too big, too all-consuming, but it kept her alive. She never spoke his name, not once. Even when the babies looked at her with his eyes. Even when Nash started furrowing his brow in that same serious way Silas used to. Even when Indigo smiled sideways, the way he did when he found something quietly amusing. They had his DNA, but they had her spirit. They were wild and gentle, stubborn and sweet, and they belonged to her. At night after they fell asleep, Juniper sometimes sat by the window with a mug of tea, looking out at the forest beyond their backyard. She imagined him far away, in a high-rise apartment filled with silence, maybe drinking expensive whiskey, maybe laughing with someone who didn't know her name. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he had any idea he had children. But the truth always came back like a bruise. He didn't care enough to find out. He'd erased her because it was easier than staying, and now she had no interest in chasing ghosts. Still, she saved everything. Every medical receipt, every photo, every first word and handprint. Not because she hoped he would come back one day, but because her children would ask. Someday they would want to know who he was, and when they did, she would give them the truth. Not a fairy tale, not revenge, just the honest story of a woman who loved deeply, was abandoned quietly, and chose to rise anyway. Juniper began taking evening courses online. Nothing dramatic, just small steps toward a degree in child development. She volunteered at the local community center during the twins' naps, taught art to kids once a week, and gradually became known in town as the strong one. She didn't feel strong most days, but strength isn't always something you feel. Sometimes it's something you do. And life went on. She raised her children with compassion and structure. She built a small world full of color, music, and bedtime stories. And she swore to herself that even if the past came knocking one day, she would answer not with anger or desperation, but with grace, because the worst had already happened. And she had survived it. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, hidden between a stack of utility bills and grocery store coupons. Juniper had just gotten the twins down for their midday nap, the quiet moment she carved out for herself with a cup of weak coffee and a few pages from whatever book she was pretending she had time to finish. She almost missed it. The envelope was thick, expensive, and bore no return address. Her name was handwritten in gold ink, flawless calligraphy that didn't belong to anyone she knew. She opened it slowly, more out of curiosity than concern, and felt the breath leave her lungs before she even reached the card inside. The embossed names stared back at her like a slap. Silas Creed and Valerie Voss request the honor of your presence. Her fingers trembled. For a long time she couldn't move. Her eyes flicked back to the envelope, trying to make sense of it. There was no way this was meant for her. There had to be some mistake, except it wasn't. The address was hers. The handwriting was deliberate. The names were real. Silas was getting married to someone else. Officially, publicly, grandly. She stared at the date. It was 10 days away. The venue listed was in the Berkshires, not far from where she and the twins lived now. It was a name she recognized from headlines, an estate that cost more than her entire hometown. Her stomach turned, not from heartbreak, but from the way memory collided with the present. He hadn't just moved on. He'd erased her. All of it. Their marriage, their children, her existence. She turned the invitation over in her hands as if there might be more. A note, a mistake, a cruel prank. But there was nothing. Only a card too heavy with intention and silence. Juniper dropped it on the kitchen table and stood motionless for a while. The air in the room felt different now, charged with something between disbelief and fury. She hadn't thought about Silas in months, not directly, not deliberately. Her focus had been survival, motherhood, building a life out of what he left behind. But now seeing his name next to someone else's on a wedding card made it real in a way nothing else had. He wasn't just gone. He was rewriting the story as if she had never been part of it. Later that evening, after she put the twins to bed and the house fell into stillness, She poured herself a glass of red wine and sat at the table with the invitation lying in front of her like a challenge. She wasn't crying. There was no room for tears, only calculation, only the fire of clarity. For years, she'd stayed quiet, raised his children, built a life from the ruins he left behind, and told no one. But now he was parading around in the open, pretending she never existed, pretending Indigo and Nash didn't breathe with his blood in their veins. She thought back to the letter he never sent, the goodbye he never gave, and the children he never knew. They deserved more than silence. They deserved acknowledgement, and she deserved to reclaim her voice. She found the twins' best clothes, the ones she'd bought for a future family photo that never happened. She made sure their hair was neat, their shoes polished. And when she looked at them sleeping that night, side by side in their small beds, she made a decision, not out of spite, not for revenge, but for truth. She would go to the wedding, not to beg, not to plead, not to win, but to show the world who had really been left behind and who had survived. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't know what she would do, but she knew one thing for certain. She was done being erased. The wedding day dawned bright and polished, as if the sky itself had been scrubbed clean for the occasion. The Creed-Voss union had made headlines for weeks. Two dynasties merging, the business world buzzing with rumors, photos of the bride's dress fittings, leaked menus, aerial shots of the venue. Juniper stood in front of her small bathroom mirror, pulling her hair into a low knot with shaking hands. Her dress was simple, cream-colored linen, long-sleeved, no frills, but it fit her like truth. Her face was calm, though her stomach had been in knots since dawn. Indigo and Nash sat on the edge of the bed, swinging their legs and asking questions she didn't have the answers to. She told them they were going somewhere important. She didn't tell them who they were about to see. The estate was more massive than she imagined. White stone buildings with columns and balconies, marble fountains spitting crystal water, manicured hedges carved into meaningless shapes of status. The valet looked confused as Juniper walked up the driveway instead of arriving in a luxury car. She didn't care. She walked like someone who had nothing to prove and nothing left to lose, each child holding one of her hands. She passed confused glances, whispers, eyes that didn't recognize her, but knew she didn't belong. The ceremony was already underway when she entered the garden. The crowd stood in polite silence as music played softly, and the bride began her descent down the stone steps, all ivory and diamonds, her smile rehearsed. Silas stood at the altar, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression unreadable, as polished as the silver cufflinks on his sleeves. For a second, Juniper froze. He looked exactly the same, and nothing like the man she once knew. The children fidgeted at her sides, sensing the tension in her breath. Then came the moment. If anyone objects to this union, the words hung in the air like fragile glass. No one moved. No one breathed. Until she did. Juniper stepped forward slowly, deliberately, the heels of her boots clicking against the stone. Heads turned. Whispers surged through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. She didn't stop walking until she stood between the guests and the altar, her children still beside her, now clutching her fingers tightly. Silas's eyes widened. He took one step back without realizing it, as if some part of him understood what was coming before his mind could catch up. Juniper didn't yell. She didn't cry. She looked directly at him and spoke in a voice so steady it silenced everything else. "I believe I have reason to object." The crowd gasped. Valerie turned, blinking in disbelief, her bouquet drooping slightly in her hand. Silas opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Juniper reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, a candid one, slightly faded, from the twins' second birthday. Indigo had cake on her face, Nash was mid-laugh, and both of them were sitting on a quilt Juniper had sewn herself. She held the photo up, not to him, but to the guests. "These are his children." There was a wave of movement, people leaning, whispering, lifting phones, capturing what would be on every news site within the hour. Silas looked like the air had been pulled from his lungs. Valerie stepped back, her eyes narrowing as she pieced things together. Juniper turned her gaze back to him, not angry, not broken, just clear. "You disappeared," she said, her voice still calm. "You left without a word, erased me, and never once asked what came after. So I thought I'd bring the answer to you." She looked down at the twins, who were staring at the man in the suit like he was some story they'd been waiting to hear the end of. Nash tugged lightly on her sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. Is that him? Juniper bent down, kissed the top of his head, and answered softly. That's the man who helped make you, but he's not the one who raised you. The silence that followed was thunderous. The crowd didn't move. Silas didn't speak. He looked like a man who had been cracked open in front of strangers and found nothing but his own reflection staring back. Juniper turned. She didn't wait for a reply. She didn't need one. She took her children's hands again and walked away, past the guests, past the photographers, past the rows of chairs where polished people sat frozen in judgment and disbelief. She left behind the wealth, the lies, the carefully constructed illusion. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Not because she'd exposed him, but because she had chosen herself. The days after the wedding were chaos, but not for Juniper. For her, they were surprisingly quiet. She returned home with Indigo and Nash just as the sun began to set, their small hands still wrapped around hers like they understood, in some strange, intuitive way, that something important had just happened. She cooked them dinner like usual, macaroni, sliced apples, and peas from the freezer, and read them their favorite bedtime book without rushing, without explaining. She tucked them in and sat with them until they both fell asleep, their bodies curled like commas between sentences she had yet to finish. Then she went downstairs, turned on the news, and waited. The world, on the other hand, had caught fire. By morning, her face was everywhere, on entertainment sites, in corporate gossip blogs, even in formal business publications dissecting the Creedvoss scandal. Every headline some variation of, mysterious woman with twins interrupts billionaire wedding. Some articles speculated she was a mistress, others a con artist. Only a few bothered to ask who she really was. Juniper didn't offer answers. She let the world spin its story while she returned to work at the bookstore as if nothing had changed. But things had changed, just not in the way the public assumed. Silas tried to contact her 2 days later. The call came through a private number. She didn't pick up. The next morning, a letter arrived, handwritten on expensive paper. He didn't try to explain the wedding. He didn't deny the truth. Instead, he wrote that seeing the twins had left him shaken in a way he couldn't describe. He said he didn't come after her all those years ago, not because he stopped caring, but because he never believed he was capable of giving anyone a life worth staying for. The letter ended with no request. Just a sentence that stood out. If you'll allow it, I'd like to meet them. Not as a father, not yet. Just as a man who missed too much. Juniper read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it neatly and placed it in the box where she kept every ultrasound photo, every report card, every tiny shoe they outgrew. She didn't respond, not immediately. She needed time. And she wasn't going to let a beautifully written apology undo the years she spent building her own peace. But Silas didn't disappear this time. He moved into a rental a few blocks away. Not flashy, not guarded. He didn't show up at her door, didn't stalk her at work, didn't make any grand declarations. Instead, he started volunteering at the town library on Thursdays, the same one where Indigo and Nash attended story time. He shelved books, helped rearrange the reading corner, quietly asked the librarian for parenting recommendations. Every week, he'd linger near the doorway as Juniper walked in with the kids, never too close, never assuming. He waited. The first time Nash walked up to him, it wasn't because he'd been told to. It was because he dropped a toy dinosaur, and Silas picked it up and offered it back with a soft, "Stegosaurus?" Nash grinned. Indigo followed, cautious but curious. Juniper watched from across the room. She didn't interrupt. She didn't interfere. She just observed. By the 3rd week, the twins had started saving questions for him. Do you like peanut butter sandwiches? Were you ever a kid? Why do you talk like someone who reads all the time? He answered everyone with honesty, sometimes fumbling, sometimes laughing. There were no expectations, no pressure. He never called himself dad. He never reached out to touch them. He let them set the terms. It wasn't easy to watch. Part of Juniper wanted to protect them from the possibility of being hurt again. Another part of her, one she hadn't listened to in years, was surprised by how patient he was, how quiet, how aware of what he had broken. He never rushed. He never asked for more than what they gave. One evening after a long day, Juniper sat alone on her porch, the sky bruised with purple and gold. She heard footsteps behind her. Silas stopped at the gate, not daring to cross it. She didn't tell him to go. "I'm not trying to earn forgiveness," he said. "I'm trying to stay long enough to deserve a second chance, whatever that looks like." She looked at him then. Not the man who vanished, not the CEO who lived in headlines, but the one who now showed up week after week to shelve children's books and ask about dinosaurs. And something in her, something small but alive, didn't flinch at the idea of letting him stand there. "I'm not promising anything," she said quietly. "I wouldn't believe you if you did," he replied. And that night, as she sat in silence long after he left, Juniper realized the strangest thing of all wasn't that he had returned. It was that she wasn't angry anymore. She was cautious. She was guarded. But she wasn't burning. And for the first time, that felt like something real. Summer in Marlow arrived slowly, like it needed permission. The trees bloomed cautiously, as if they too had endured a long, uncertain winter. Juniper watched the seasons shift from her back porch, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, the twins playing in the grass with paper airplanes they had folded themselves. Nash's kept crashing nose first into the dirt, but Indigo's soared with surprising grace, catching the wind just right, rising before it dipped and then rising again. It reminded her of something she couldn't name, something soft and persistent, like hope refusing to give up. Silas had been in town for 4 months now. They hadn't defined anything, hadn't forced anything. He still lived in the rented house down the road, still showed up at the library every Thursday, and sometimes on Saturdays, now and then bringing new books for the kids or sitting on the floor helping them build Lego castles that always collapsed in the same spot. He was careful, not in a way that kept distance, but in a way that respected it. He never pressed, never asked for more than she was willing to give, and yet he was there, constant in a way she hadn't expected, reliable in a way she hadn't thought possible from him. One morning after picking up pastries from the bakery, he showed up at her door with a strange look on his face, something between nerves and something gentler, like gratitude. He handed her a plain manila envelope and said, "This is the last piece I owed you." Inside were documents, legal ones. They dissolved the old prenup, the dissolution agreement, and anything else that implied she was once a forgotten name on his lawyer's desk. There was no financial manipulation, no strings, no catches, just clean, open space. "I don't want to erase what we were," he told her as she read in silence, "but I needed to undo how I handled it. You were never disposable." She didn't cry. She didn't throw herself into his arms. She simply nodded, folded the papers, and put them in a drawer. Later, she let him help her prep dinner, standing shoulder to shoulder in the kitchen, slicing peppers while the kids painted quietly in the other room. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was something else, something she had learned to live inside. Quiet understanding. Weeks passed. He began walking the kids to school some mornings when Juniper had early shifts. They invited him to Indigo's dance recital and Nash's first parent-child science day. And when other parents asked who he was, Juniper didn't freeze or deflect. She simply said, "He's part of their life." And it felt true. The night before the twins' 5th birthday, she sat on the porch again, staring at the stars. Silas came by late, holding a gift bag and a bottle of ginger ale, knowing she couldn't drink but that she still liked the ritual of pouring something fizzy into a glass. They sat in companionable silence, feet up on the railing, the crickets loud enough to fill the spaces they didn't need to fill with words. "I want to ask you something," he said eventually, not looking at her. She waited. "If we ever got there, slowly, honestly, do you think we could try again? As two different people, not trying to fix the past, just starting from now?" She looked at him for a long moment. There was no desperation in his voice, no expectation, just quiet, open sincerity. She didn't answer right away. She didn't owe him easy answers, but she also didn't turn away. "Maybe," she said, "not for them, not out of guilt, but because I'm not afraid of you anymore. And I'm not afraid of myself." The next day, the house was full of balloons and laughter. The twins tore through wrapping paper, while friends from school played tag in the backyard. Juniper stood in the kitchen, frosting cupcakes, when she caught Silas outside, holding Indigo on his shoulders while Nash tugged on his arm, shouting for him to chase them both. He looked different now. Lighter. Less like a man guarding a fortress, and more like one planting a garden. That night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, Juniper opened the box where she kept the things she'd once hidden. His letters, their marriage license, old photographs folded with time. She took them out one by one, laid them on the table, and then gathered them all together into a new envelope. She labeled it with a single word, before. Then she pulled out a fresh journal and wrote at the top of the first page, after. Because some stories don't need perfect endings, just honest new chapters.